First of all, Mr. President, I want also to say to Mr. Kirkhope, good luck in the House of Lords, and I'm pretty sure that we shall have a good defender of the European Union in the House of Lords from now on. Dear colleagues, Václav Havel, who was at that moment Czech president, warned in a speech in this House, I think it was in 1994, that Europe could, and I quote him, fall into the hands of a cast of fools, fanatics, populists, demagogues, determined to promote the worst European traditions. And Havel would turn 80 today. But I think that his warning is more relevant than ever, and that President, and also I say to the President of the Commission, the challenges of the next European Council are proof of that. And I have, in fact, the same priorities as Manfred Weber already put on the table. I think you have to talk about the tragedy in Syria. I cannot imagine that you return to your capitals after this European Council without decisive action on what is happening in Aleppo, and it will not be sufficient only to say, oh, we're going to liberate 25 million humanitarian aid, because you know very well today that it's even impossible to transfer this aid to the poor people in Aleppo. You will need to do other things, more difficult decisions to take on eventually sanctions against Putin and Assad, and on eventually installing a non-fly zone above Aleppo. Otherwise, this tragedy will continue. And that is, I think, the first priority, dear colleagues, we have for this European Council. So I cannot imagine that you go back and say, yeah, that's for Mrs. Mogherini, and we have nothing to say about this. My second priority, dear colleagues, is, that's another point that Manfred Weber didn't mention, but I'm going to mention it, is finally fixing the cracks in our financial foundations. It's now 8 years that we are discussing that, and that we not have definitely cleaned up the financial mess in Europe. And that means two things: a full-fledged banking union. We don't have it for the moment. And secondly, an economic governance that is far better than a stability pact, let's be honest, that is never applied from Greece until Portugal. And it's not better in the north of Europe. We've got problems with Greek banks, Irish banks, Spanish banks, Portuguese banks, Italian banks, Cypriot banks, Belgian banks, Dutch banks, and now it's Deutsche Bank that is on the brink, creating further uncertainty, prolonging, in fact, the credit crunch in Europe. And the US, I remember you that the US wanted it immediately after the financial crisis. They have put $400 billion in their system, cleaned up the banking sector, and every penny has been paid back since they have done that. And what we are doing in Europe, we are still debating, in fact, a banking union. We are still debating an economic governance. And my plea to the presidency of the European Council is that finally, in the European Council, work is done. The 5 presidents' report is approved, and it is a fundamental mistake, Mr. President, to think that we can get rid of it. And that's the second priority, in my opinion, for this European Council. And then the third priority for the European Council is, I think, dealing, in fact, with the UK decision to leave the Union. I think it's impossible that you say nothing about it. And I think that you have to respond to the announcement of Prime Minister May. And in my opinion, you have to say 4 simple things, very short. First, no pre-negotiations. We can only start negotiations after the triggering of Article 50. And secondly, negotiations need to be finished before the next European election. I cannot imagine that Mr. Farage is coming back to this hemicycle, dear colleagues. And 3, the new EU relationship with the UK needs to be a close one, not only in our interest, but also in the interest, I should say, of the 48% of British citizens that have voted for Remain. And let's not forget it. And finally, whatever the new relationship will be, dear colleagues, it can never infringe our 4 fundamental freedoms. My conclusion is clear. Europe will never, in fact, never be up. The European values will never be up for negotiation.
Herr Verhofstadt, bitte kommen Sie zu Ende.